It was a very horrifying experience had by a father and son duo who, in the spring of 1987 in eastern South Carolina, would have an experience that would profoundly affect the way that they saw the great outdoors and the way that they saw nature for the rest of their lives. Henry, the father, is now almost 75 years old. And Henry is a man who has saw things in his life, a man who has been around, to include a combat deployment to Vietnam while he was in the United States military. And I assessed Henry, as well as his son Keith, to be pretty solid guys. Unflappable, calm, cool, and collected. Very, very credible. As I looked in their eyes and I watched their eyes as they told me about the experiences that they had on that cool Friday evening in 1987. Now, Henry would serve his country and he'd come back home and shortly thereafter purchase a piece of property near Lake Moultrie, South Carolina. He would marry and he and his wife would have 2 sons. He raised his sons in the same manner that he was raised, and that was to appreciate everything the outdoors has to offer. And he raised them to continue the family tradition of these weekend fishing and camping trips. Now, it was on a Friday in early spring of 1987, early afternoon. He and his oldest son, Keith, packed up all their gear, loaded the boat up, and headed to their favorite camping spot. And this camping spot was actually owned by one of their relatives. It was right there at water, and they were able to use it as a shoving off point for their fishing expeditions each day. They arrived at camp early and was excited to get some afternoon fishing in before the sun set. So they got camp set up and squared away and got the boat out on the water, and off they went. And to their joy, that afternoon, the fishing was incredible. As we would say here in the South, they caught a whole mess of fish, but the time came that they needed to turn around and head back to camp so that they could get back before dark. And this experience gave them a new reason to not want to be outside in the dark. As they headed back, Henry found himself daydreaming, thinking about the spots they would hit the next day. They would have all of the next day and part of Sunday to do some fishing. But his son Keith, pointing out something up ahead, interrupted his thoughts. And Keith said, "Dad, ain't it a little bit cold for somebody to be standing in the river this time of year?" And there in the distance, Henry saw who he was talking about. Now, at that distance, a couple of things stood out to Henry. First of all, this was a very, very tall individual. And secondly, they appeared to be wearing very, very bulky clothing because they looked very wide and broad. As they got closer, they were starting to be able to see a little bit of detail. The sun was still up, but it was getting low. And the shadow and the light that time of day can play tricks on the mind. But Henry's perspective changed of what he was seeing. Instead of looking like a big tall man wearing bulky clothing, it suddenly appeared with the closer distance that this was a very, very tall man, but strangely enough was standing in the river wearing a full-length long fur coat. And as he and Keith got closer, it was obvious that this person had its back turned to him and Keith. So he stopped the boat and he shouted and said, "If you need to reel in a fishing line, I can stop here and wait for a minute." And he got no response from this person. As the boat drifted a little bit closer, suddenly this person turned around fairly quickly. And it was very, very obvious that this was not a person, but something else. There, before their very eyes, was a very, very large, 7+ feet tall creature, completely covered in hair except for the face. Henry noted that it had an odd-shaped head, no neck, very broad-shouldered, very big torso, very big legs, and that its arms hung down, more so than a man's would. Henry knew he wasn't looking at a man, but he wasn't sure what he was looking at. At first, he thought it was some kind of ape or gorilla. But as he looked into this creature's face, he saw more human-like characteristics than anything else. And finally, the creature looked up and made eye contact with him. Henry said that he felt frozen in time. Keith said that at the time, he turned his face away and that it was quiet. Then suddenly, without warning, this creature threw its head back, looking up toward the sky, and screamed, yelled a terrifying sound to Henry and young Keith. And then the creature bent slightly over at the waist and slapped the water with both hands, open hands, very violently, screamed again, and took a couple steps toward him. The water was up to its waist, give or take, but it was moving pretty quickly in the water. It did the whole thing over again. It screamed, but it screamed straight at him, looking into Henry's eyes, and slapped the water again and took a couple more steps. Henry said it was at that point that he sort of came out of a state of hypnosis or something. It was hard for him to describe to this day. But when he came to, he told his son to hold on. He turned around and pulled the start cord to that old outboard motor and opened the throttle up as wide as it would go and turned that boat around, and they started heading in the opposite direction. Now, as Henry steered the boat with one hand, with the motor steer, he had to keep an eye ahead to make sure he wasn't going to run aground or hit something. He had to turn around and keep an eye on this creature. And the creature was still coming, but it was coming slow. And it was obvious to him that they were opening up the ground between them and this creature. And finally, Henry just turned around and paid attention to what was in front of him. He looked down and saw that his son Keith had gotten on the floor of the boat and was kind of holding on to one of his legs. And they sped off. And finally, they'd put a lot of distance between them and the place where they saw this creature. The creature was not to be seen. Henry stopped the boat. He was shaking. He was nauseated. He said he felt somewhat dizzy. His son sat at his feet saying, "Dad, what was that? Is it going to get us? Are there more of them?" Henry hadn't thought about that. While continuing to kind of glance around all areas around him quickly, a thought occurred to Henry. They were going to have to go back that same direction or beach the boat and go by land to their camp. But as he thought about it, he figured that as big as that creature was, that it could easily overtake them on land, and that their chances were probably better to stay on the water. So he took the anchor rope off. He tied one end around his son's waist, tied the other end of the rope around his waist to connect the two, told him to lay down in the boat. He started up the engine. They headed back in that direction. He proceeded cautiously, finally had to get his flashlight out to illuminate the water in front of him. He watched the shorelines. He watched the water. He didn't see the creature. They reached the spot where they had saw the creature. Nothing in sight. And he was so very relieved. He told his son, "Don't get up." He opened the throttle fully. He felt that he had to get them out of there right then, right now. He just was overwhelmed by this sense of urgency and some panic, which was not in his character, not in his personality. But as they sped through the spot where they had saw the creature, suddenly there were splashes around the boat. It was obvious something was being thrown. Splashes in front, beside. He heard a couple clanks as what turned out to be rocks hit the bottom, landed in the boat. They got back to camp. They quickly packed up and got out of there. He told his son, he said, "I don't want you to mention this to anybody at all until I say further." As they were driving home, the thought hit him. He said, there had to be more than one because of all the rocks that were being thrown. The next day, Henry called a relative of his wife, who was a retired game warden out of the state of Georgia. And he told the game warden what happened, swore him to secrecy, and the game warden gave him simple advice. He said, "You're not the first person to see things like this. I'd keep it to yourself and stay out of that area." To this day, they have not ever been back to that specific area. And now, whether they're together or apart and they're out there fishing, going down a river or a creek, they're looking ahead to see if that creature is going to reappear once again.